My name is Gary Rogowski. I've been building furniture for some 20 years now. And I have to tell you, I still walk into the shop on a Saturday with the best of intentions to build a weekend project. And some 3 weeks later, I'm still building it. My work is based on traditional joinery, mortise-and-tenons, dovetails, basic, classic, hand-cut joinery. But I don't have the time to cut these by hand. I don't get paid enough to do this kind of loving work as much as I would like to. So I've had to develop strategies over the years to enable me to cut quick and accurate joints. In my experience, the router is the best tool in the shop for the job. Now, every cutting tool has to reference off of one surface. You index off a surface to make a cut. So a hand plane uses the sole of the plane to index a cut. A chisel will use the back or bevel to help reference a cut. A table saw uses the fence and table. Now, a router is perhaps the most adaptable tool in the shop. You can index cuts with bits, bearing-mounted bits, template guide, jigs, and fixtures. It's perhaps the most versatile, adaptable tool in the wood shop. Now, in this video, I'm going to show you how to cut router joinery with three basic types of furniture construction. These are carcass work, frame and panel joinery, and stool and bench construction, or chair and table construction. In cabinet work, rabbets, dadoes, and grooves are used for joining up carcass sides, connecting shelves and cases, and for letting backs into cabinets. Rabbets are cut along the edge of a board, while dadoes and grooves are set in from the edge. What's the difference between a dado and a groove? Mostly it's semantics. A dado runs across the grain, while a groove runs parallel to the grain. The practical difference is that with the groove, you don't have to worry about tear out at the end of a cut. While a dado cut cross grain, you have to prevent tear out. We'll see more about this in a bit. I want to build a small box to hold my router. I need something simple to make, but I still want it to be strong. A rabbet joint cut in plywood will give me good gluing surface and an excellent way to reference the joints when I glue up. I mount a fence to my router when cutting rabbets topside. It needs to be placed in a position relative to the bit so that the router will cut only as much material as I need. In this case, my rabbet needs to be cut at a full 3/4 inch. So with the 3/4 inch bit in place, I set the fence appropriately, double checking it against the edge of my ply. Next, I set my depth of cut with the stop provided on this plunge router. I loosen the depth scale on the router and use my ruler to set in the depth I want. I double check this distance right down at the depth stop. Even with a bit this large, it's best not to take too big a bite out of your material. Take light passes and eventually get to your full width and depth of cut. I set my depth at an 1/8 inch and lock my plunge router in place. When I get close to the end, I pull my router away from the work and restart the cut by moving my router into the work. I make my last pass from left to right on the work to clean up the cut. I got lucky. The end of the rabbeted piece is just a tad proud, so there's just a little to clean up. Now, when routing topside, 99% of your cuts will be made by moving the router from left to right around the work. In other words, the router is pushed so that the bit is pulled into the work. Moving right to left tends to push the bit away from the work. So while it does cut, much of the effort is in keeping the router into the cut. How does this happen? Here's an animated router bit as I'd look down on it in a handheld router, spinning clockwise within its base. I'll move it up to this board and begin to make a cut, moving from left to right. As the router moves along the board, the bit engages the wood and applies force to it in a sweeping arc. As each flute sweeps through the wood, the force starts in this direction and ends up in this direction, averaging sort of in this direction. So as old Isaac Newton said, for every router push against the wood, there's an equal and opposite push by the wood against the router. The router is forced into the board, and its fence is pulled snugly against the board's edge. If I reverse the router's direction of travel, moving into the board from right to left, look what happens now. The bit still spins clockwise, of course. The router's forces on the wood are distributed around the arc of the cut like this, averaging in this direction. So the router, with its fence, is pushed away from the board, and I've got to supply a constant thrust against the router to keep it from walking away. I've made rabbet cuts now on just 2 of my box sides. See how they help locate the other pieces so that when I apply glue or fasteners, like screws or nails, they won't slip around. The rabbet joint helps to form a nice square corner that, if laid out and cut properly, yields just a minimum of cleanup to do. To fit a bottom into this box, I make a 1/4-inch rabbet in just the same way, along the back edge of each piece. A piece of 1/4-inch plywood fits right into these rabbets, helping to square up the box. Another way to cut rabbets is with a bearing-guided rabbeting bit. The distance is set between the bearing and the cutting edge. Now in this mirror frame I've clamped onto the bench, I'll cut a 3/8 rabbet. The rabbeting bit, which has a 1/4-inch shank on it, is mounted in a production router with a rack and pinion depth adjustment. Make sure the collet nut is tight on the bit. And make very sure that when you mount a wide diameter bit like this one, that it has room to spin inside the router base. Now I set the bit height for an 1/8-inch cut. Light cuts are always better. Plug it in, I'm ready to go. I start my first pass by setting the router securely on the frame and then plunging into the work as deep as the bearing allows. The bearing prevents me from cutting too deep and rides along the edge of the wood. The first cut is made moving left to right inside the frame. This is the proper feed direction. I keep good pressure on the hand riding above the work. Notice how I've raised the frame up off my bench a little to prevent the bearing, which sits on the bottom of the bit, from digging into the bench top. The cutter will leave a round corner, which I'll clean up later. I was afraid of this. So much for the proper feed direction. Well, it's only my first pass, no harm done. I can come back and route what's called a climb cut now to score the edge of my frame first. It's not a cut to full depth, just a scoring cut. But then I route in the proper direction again to full depth, with the bearing riding right against the frame. This first pass with the rabbeting bit told me a lot about how the wood in this frame wants to be cut. Oftentimes with a rabbeting bit, you'll need to make a climb cut to prevent tear out. Here's how you get tear out with a router. As the bit sweeps through its arc, each wood fiber that it cuts is backed up by another just behind it, until the bit gets to the edge where it finds wood that isn't backed up by anything, just air. This outer fiber is in danger of tearing out ahead of the cut, especially if the grain is angled into the oncoming bit. You won't always get tear out in this situation. It depends on depth of cut, feed rate, bit diameter, and how the wood sprites are feeling that day. But if you do, climb cutting is the remedy. In climb cutting, we reverse feed direction, which also changes the bit's angle of bite into the wood. Now, all the wood fibers behind the cut are supported fibers, meaning there's always more wood just ahead of the cutting edge in the spin direction of the bit. No tear out. Why not cut this way all the time? Well, remember that last little animated lesson about forces on the router? In climb cutting, the bit and the router tend to get pushed away from the wood, which means you've got to fight to keep your router into the work instead of concentrating on making a smooth cut. After I climb cut at each depth setting, I make a cleanup pass. Then I set the depth again. See how the climb cut tends to move the router along? The bit is actually pushing the router away from the work, so it tries to skitter along the edge. It's a much slower and more controlled pass, moving left to right in the proper direction to clean up the cut. Now it's time to clean up my corners. I use a marking knife and my 6-inch rule to score lines where I'll chop. Then using a mortising chisel, I'll clean all these corners up. For this cabinet shelf, I could use a dado the full thickness of my stock, like this. Or I could use a shouldered dado, like this. Now the difference between a full dado and a shoulder dado is that with a full dado, you have to match your bit to the thickness of the stock, or take your stock down to the size of your bit. This is particularly a problem in plywood with its inconsistent thicknesses. So you can use a shouldered dado and a single tenon that will match your smaller bit size. I'm going to make the cut for the full dado first. I mount a straight bit with 2 cutting edges in the rudder. This is called a 2-flute bit, which gives me a smoother cut than a single flute bit. The bit I mount is the full size of my shelf stock, and I lock it firmly in place. I adjust the height of the bit so that only 1/8 of an inch is showing above the router base. Then I check the distance from the cutting edge of the bit to the edge of the router base. I have penciled in marks on my board where I want the shelf to go. Now all I have to do is measure from those marks to a straight edge, and then check to see that the straight edge is square to my board, and at a point exactly equal to the distance I measured on my router base, all the while keeping it square and trying not to bump it. Hey, come on, there's got to be an easier way. Well, there is. I've got a squared fence jig that lines up square to an edge automatically. It's just a flat piece of ply with a straight edge rabbeted into it at right angles. This straight edge rides along the outside edge of my board. All I have to do now is measure from my marks to this jig and clamp it firmly in place. I switch on the router and let it come up to full speed. Then with the bit still not touching the board yet, I set the router down onto the workpiece. I move the router into the work, holding it firmly to the jig. With one pass cut, I reset the depth another 1/8 of an inch. Make sure there is no schmutz, no sawdust or debris between the router base and the fence, and always make sure that the router is held firmly to the fence. Now here's a tip for accuracy that you might not be aware of. You have a nice round router base, but it may not be concentric with your router bit. To ensure a nice parallel cut with your fence, make sure that you keep one point always in contact with the fence, that you don't spin this base because you may not end up with a parallel cut. Another way to ensure this is to add a sub base with a straight edge already built into it, like this 1/4 inch piece of plexiglass. Running that against the fence will give you a parallel cut. One other way is to use a router with the straight edge built into the base. And this is a nice way of ensuring a parallel cut. Template guides are steel rub collars that fit into the bottom of a router base. They are mounted with screws to the base. They come in a variety of sizes. There is an inside diameter and an outside diameter to a template guide, as well as an offset from the outside to the bit. And this offset is important to measure and remember, or even write down on a jig. To lay out for the shouldered dado, I measure and mark out the position of my shelf again. But now I lay out the width of my narrower dado as well, in this case 3/8 of an inch. I square these marks across my board so we can see them more clearly. Since this is also a stop dado cut, I mark back from the edge a 1/2 inch or so and put in a gauge line with my marking gauge. I lay on my squared straight edge again, but this time the offset is only the amount of difference between the bit and the outside of the template guide. The router rests on top of the straight edge jig now, while the template guide rides against it. I set my depth of cut again with my ruler and the depth stop. Raise up the router and then make my cuts. Watch how the router jerks when I switch it on. I've got a good grip on it, but I still can't prevent that kick when it first comes on. So make sure the bit is not touching anything when you turn the motor on. Now, since this is a stop cut, I have to be aware of where to begin the cut. It comes through at the rear, so that's not a concern, but at the front, where the gauge line is, I have to be careful not to route past that line. It will take several passes to get down to depth and to get close to my gauge line. Now, I've been showing you a lot of topside or handheld router applications. It's very useful, but there's another way you can mount your router to do a great deal of router work, and that's here. This is a router table, a very rudimentary form, very simple form. I've got an extra base mounted to a flat sheet of melamine. I clamp this to a bench or table. It's portable. And onto this, I can take this same router motor that's mounted here and mount it under here. Now, by mounting a fence on top of the table, you can index your cuts, clamping it in place to the router table. Now, the advantage here is that you can run shorter pieces past the bit with greater safety. You can clamp stops to the fence to index your cuts for multiple passes. There's lots of ways that this setup can be used to make a variety of joinery cuts with your router. Now, there are commercially available router tables. Those are great. There's a lot of gadgets on them, exhaust ports, miter gauge slots. There's lots of ways that you can jazz these up, separate tables. This is a very basic approach. I use it. It works. Now, I want to cut a 5/8 dado, but I've got a 3/8 bit. What do I do? Here's one solution. Make successive passes with a 3/8 bit and a 1/4 inch spacer. So I've got my 3/8 bit, piece of 1/4 inch scrap, and with successive passes, first with the spacer in place and then removed, I can yield a full 5/8 inch dado. Now, the other thing I want to pay attention to is, since I'm cutting cross grain with this cut, when I exit, I want to have a backer piece in place to prevent tear out. This piece of plywood will suffice for that. One other thing, make very sure that you know where your fingers are when you make this cut, because if this bit comes out and your thumb's in the wrong spot, it could be dangerous. So be aware of where your hands are. Never have them directly over the bit. Don't have them at the exit point of the cut. To get to the depth required, I'll need to reset my bit height and make some new passes. Your feed rate over the bit is another important concern. Moving too slowly over the bit can cause burning, but moving too quickly can lead to inaccuracies or excessive wear and tear on your motor. Here's the full dado cut I just made. It shows through at the front of the case. And I've done another cut, which is a stopped, shouldered cut, to show you the difference. Here's what that cut looks like. And these are the two shoulders, and this end cut back, so that the joint doesn't show through at the face. I make these cross-grain cuts first and then follow up with my rabbet cuts. A couple of things to pay attention to. These shelves are cut to the same length. The depth of cut for both of them are the same, about 1/3 of the thickness of the stock. This makes it simpler to lay these out and cut the joints. The dadoes are cut first, as I said, and then I come back and cut the rabbets. These are through rabbets on the long boards and stopped rabbets on the short ends. These are stopped so that I don't mess up my nice dovetail pin. To cut these rabbets on the router table, I can use the same bit as I used to cut my dadoes. I reset my fence so that only part of the bit is showing. I rotate my bit so that one flute is farthest away from the fence, measure to this point, and clamp my fence in place. I'm taking a small pass and some plywood scrap to double check my fence setting. Always take practice cuts before committing your good stock to the router. It looks good, so I'll proceed. Now I'll make the through rabbets. See how it misses that dovetail? Both of my boards get this through rabbet cut at this first depth setting. Now I need to set stops somewhere on my fence for the stopped rabbets. How do you know where to set your stops? There are a couple of ways. We need to determine the length of our stopped rabbet on this piece. It will run up to the inside corner plus the depth of cut on this rabbet. So from this inside corner formed by this shoulder here plus the depth of cut here. Now this is where our cut will go. It lines up with this inside shoulder plus our depth of cut. So inside corner plus depth of cut. This is where we want our stopped cut to end. Now we need to line up this bit so that its cutting edges are in line with this axis parallel to the fence. Then, with pencil marks on our board, we line those up with first this side of the bit and set a stop. Then, we line up the second side. I place one end of my board against the stop and an edge against the fence. Then the board is gradually lowered down onto the bit. See how I move it back and forth a little to get the cut started? Then I make a full pass all the way to the other stop. Carefully lift the board off the bit, holding it firmly to the fence as you lift. Now another way to set your stops is to take a board with a square edge, set it up to the bit, and rotate the bit so that it gets pushed away, and mark the cutting edges of your bit. Then with the rabbet marked onto my board, I line up one end on the left side pencil mark and lower my work onto the bit. There is no actual stop here to reference off of or push against, just your good eye and steady hand. Move along to the other pencil mark and line that up with the mark on your board. Then carefully lift the piece off the bit. My dadoes have been cut. Both my through dadoes and my stop dadoes have been cut at a 1/4 inch depth. So what I want to set up is this fence on my router table at a 1/4 inch from the cutting edge So I need to have the bit rotated so that its cutting edges are aligned in this axis, and this cutting edge of the bit is at a point a 1/4 inch away from the fence at its farthest, like so. Now this is 3/8 of an inch, so I need to have my bit set 2 times that cut, just 3/8. Since this is a cross-grain cut, I use a backer board to prevent tear out. I don't need to cut all the way through this board either. I just cut in a little ways and then pull it away from the bit. This backer also helps provide greater stability for the pass. Now notice here that on this second cut, I only cut in about 1 inch. I do this so I can check my fit without totally committing myself to a full cut and its consequences. To check my cut, I try to fit the tongue in the dado. Almost fits. I'm close, but it's back to the router table. Since I'm this close though, I'm going to try to recut. But rather than resetting my bit height, I'm going to run my piece through with just a little more downward pressure on my board. Sometimes this works. Then when I have it right, I can do both sides of the board. That's a nice fit. Good boy. A sliding dovetail joint is one of the strongest carcass joints you can make, but it tends to confound people because it's either too loose or it's too tight. Here's how I cut them on the router table. It helps to first get rid of some of the waste in the carcass size where the joint will go. This saves your bits and your ears because this can be a screamer cut, especially in a wood like the oak I'm cutting here. Make your waste passes for the female part of the joint first, on the router table. In this example, I'm making through cuts. After these cuts are made, I change the bit. I find that my old Stanley router likes to hang on tight to bits. So the only way to persuade it to give up its grip is to support the router shaft on a solid surface and then wrap the nut, not the threads of the shaft, and the bit loosens up. Supporting that shaft protects the bearings. In goes my dovetail bit. And I crank down pretty good on these wrenches. I do not want any bit flying out of a loose collet. The bit goes in now to the full depth of cut I want because with a dovetail bit, you only get one try at this cut. With the fence in the same position as for the waste cuts, I can route the through cut. Make sure you hold the board flat here. You may get a little fuzz here, so I clean it up with my chisel and maybe some sandpaper just right on that corner of the joint. Now it's time to set up for the male part of the joint. I reset the fence so that the bit is actually buried within it. You can see how the dovetail bit just fits inside this recess in my fence. I want to set my fence for the male cuts now, and the beautiful part of this setup is that the bit height is already there. I don't have to change it at all. By cutting both parts on the router table, I eliminate one of the frustrating setups of this joint. I position the fence so the bit will just cut into one face of my board. Then I make a cut, rotate it, and cut the other face. And then check my results. Not even close. Oh well, I've got to make another pass. Remember, joinery always equals accuracy plus patience. So go slow, measure your discrepancy, how much you're off, and reset the fence.
I use a pencil mark on the router table to help me gauge how far to move the fence over. For a deeper pass, I expose more of the bit. With more bit showing, more material will be removed. With a vertical cut like this, using a taller fence for better stability might prove helpful to you. It depends on how comfortable you feel with your fence setup. Remember, you can't tip the work into the bit. Keep it tight to the fence and vertical. Still not quite there. Time to readjust and pencil mark again. I keep nibbling this joint down until it just fits into my opening. As you may well know, fitting this joint can be a study in frustration. You really need to be patient in setting it up. Here the fit is very close, but I'm afraid that if I make this next pass at my present fence setting, it might be too loose, so here's a little trick for you. If I place a shim like this dollar bill between my work and the fence, this will kick me out from the fence just a little, so I don't take as deep a pass. The dollar bill measures about 3/1000ths of an inch. You could use a $100 bill if you want a bigger shim. Just kidding. Take a pass with the shim in place and check the fit again. Now you could use a piece of paper or laminate for this shim, it doesn't matter, just so it's a consistent thickness. This fits good. But if the joint still doesn't fit now, you can remove the shim and take another pass to shave off just a hair more.
Here in this small pine cabinet I'm building here, we have a small drawer, and to put a bottom in it, we'll need to cut grooves to capture that bottom. Two different types of grooves. One set of through grooves on the sides and a stop groove in the front. Let me take this apart and show you. We will have, there's the bottom here, a groove that comes close to the edge but doesn't pop all the way through, so it doesn't show at the end here. This stop groove will start about here and run all the way down, stop short of the end at the other side, in approximately that position. So it'll stop at the ends, doesn't pop through, and there'll be a through groove here on the side pieces that'll run all the way from end to end. And we'll cut both the stop groove and the through groove on the router table.
This little trick of keeping the far block up off the table helps to prevent chips from building up against the stop and messing with my accuracy. Make sure the table is clean, no garbage against the stop. Holding the piece firmly against the stop, I slowly move the work down onto the bit. See how I work it back and forth a little to get it down to depth? Then I take a full pass at the first depth. My through cuts are done next at this depth. I reset the depth another 1/8 inch and take another pass on all my pieces. Keep those fingers away from the exit hole of a through cut and never have them above the bit, just in case a collar gives up and lets go of a bit. The stop cut is done in the same fashion again. I move right to left against the fence. I check the fit of my ply bottom against the groove. Of course this won't fit. It's 1/4 inch plywood. All right, undersized 1/4 inch plywood, but it's not thin enough to fit my 3/16 groove. I'll have to nudge the fence over just a little to get the properly sized finished groove. I reclamp the fence and take a tiny pass, pull it, and check the fit again. When it's right, I do all my cuts. If the fit is too tight, you can always scrape or sand the bottom a little to make it fit. The stop grooves end up with round corners, so I chop these square. Here I've put the drawer front and sides together, and my bottom is cut to fit exactly. See how the grooves all line up so I can slide my bottom right into place. With a sliding dovetail cut for the back of the drawer, I can put my bottom in and then glue the back in place later. The bottom isn't glued in place, but has screws running through it up into the back. In this way, if I ever need to repair the drawer, I can pull the bottom out easily.
Dovetails are useful in projects where you want to emphasize the joinery. Through dovetails can be used in a variety of carcass situations like cabinets, blanket chests, this jewelry box I'm building. They're a nice way to exhibit your hard work, and I'm going to show you how to cut them with a router. Now, through dovetails are quite visible on both faces of a corner. The long grain and end grain can be seen on all corners of the box, so it's important that the fit of the dovetails be exact. As with prepping stock for any project, mill your stock up square, flat, and with parallel edges and faces. I'm marking the outside face with the arrow pointing to the top edge. I'm using poplar and oak here because we're doing a video and wanted to show off the contrast. But really, if you make the tails and pins out of the same wood, the end grain will contrast great with the long grain. This is the Keller system. It's 2 aluminum templates mounted on wood backers. This is for the tails, and this is for the pins. The tail bit has a bearing mounted on it that rides within these accurately machined fingers. And this straight bit is for the pins.
I'm going to set up a marking gauge to mark my boards. A gauge line will help with the tear out you sometimes get with these bits. It will also help to set up my cuts. The line I set my gauge for is slightly less than the thickness of the stock. I'll mark all my boards now. Make sure you hold your gauge good and tight to the edge of the board. Next, I set one board in a vise, face side out, and at a good height. Then I set on the tail template. I spring clamp on a piece of scrap to protect the surface of my board from clamp marks. But since it's the outside face, it's up to you whether you'll want to do this. Then I center my template fingers on the stock. Now the template has no stops on it, so it can go anywhere on top of this board. So I check both edges to make sure it's evenly spaced. Then I clamp the template firmly in place and see that it's sitting down flat on top of the board. The dovetail bit is mounted here in a plunge router. See how the bit has a bearing on top of it. This router has a locking button to lock the shaft while I tighten the collet nut with a wrench. I'm checking the thickness of my stock and adding to it the thickness of the template. This number will be the full depth of cut I want, and I mark a stick with this distance. I'm doing this in case you don't have one of these plunge routers with its nifty depth adjustment. You see, the bit has to be set to full depth for one single pass, and this can be difficult to measure on some routers with a large hole in the router base. So that's why I'm using this stick, just as an alternative. I'll double check my setting right up against the gauge line. Keep the router flat on this template now. Let the bit get up to speed and then move right into the board. Remember, no tipping, no tilting, definitely no lifting of the router while you're in this cut. It's a full pass right into the work. The top bearing will ride tightly between the fingers with no side-to-side slop and give you a nice cut. But take your time. See how I'm standing on the other side of this template? This keeps me away from the chips and dust which get thrown out away from the cut. Once all the tails are cut on all your boards, then it's time to cut pins. Just like in hand cut work, the pins are marked from the tails. I put down a hand plane on the bench to support my tail board, face side up. Clamp my pin board in the vise, face side out. I line up my gauge line to the inside face of my pin board and check to make sure the boards are lined up flush on their edges. Then I mark out the pins with a scratch awl. Now once you've marked one pin board, if your tails are all cut the same, and they should be, You just need to set up a stop on the pin template to make all of your pin cuts. You don't need to keep marking out all of your pins. But it's easy to do, so this is another decision that's up to you. I spin the pin board around now so the face side is away from me, and I clamp the board in at a good height. The pin template is brought up. See how it exactly lines up with those tail marks. It's automatic. The sockets for the tails will be cut then exactly where you need them. I clamp the template in with it lining right up on those marks. The flush trimming bit is now mounted to cut the pins. I set my bit height again and double check that setting against my gauge line. The pin template has wider spaces between its fingers, so you have to make a couple of passes to cut out all the material. I score the outside face of the board and then cut first against one side of a template finger and then the other. There's some nice looking pins. Now the crucial aspect of this dovetail system is how the backer board of the pin template is aligned. Once you get yours set, never bang it or drop it, guard it, and it'll always give you the right size cut. Check the owner's manual on how to set this up properly. Again, be sure when you're making these cuts that the router is held flat to the template and that it is not tilted or lifted while the bearing is in contact with the fingers. These templates are aluminum and a router bit will cut into them.
Okay, we've got the tails and the pins cut now. Let's see how they fit. Fit pretty good. As you can see, on this little box, it'll probably end up being a toolbox, the long grain is left a little bit proud of the end grain. This is helpful when you're clamping the piece together. You can put a clamping block right over the tails and the pins and get real good pressure right over the joint. The alternative is to have the end grain of the tails and pins protruding. You do this by setting your marking gauge for slightly greater than the thickness of your stock.
Half-blind or lap dovetails are visible from only one side of a corner. This jig is for cutting them. I mount the jig securely on my bench top first. The tail piece is put in, face side away from me, to act just as a stop right now. I clamp it in, and then the pin board is butted up against it and the locating pin, face side down. It's clamped firmly in place. Next, I line up my tail board exactly where it needs to go, against the locating pin and with its top edge flush to the top of the pin board. I lock it firmly in place. See how the two boards are offset. Next, I set on the finger template and lock it in place, making sure it's flat to the stock. A template guide will ride with very little play right between these fingers. It's mounted on the router base with screws. The bit I place securely in the router. I always do this. The correct thing to do when this happens is to first put the router and base together and then mount the bit's shaft through the guide. The most important part of this jig is the depth of cut that you set the bit at. It controls the fit of the joint. If it's set too deep, it cuts too loose. Too shallow and the joint won't fit together. So there's only one setting where the fit is just right, and you have to play with this depth until you get it right. I start to cut by making a scoring pass along the entire inside face of my tailboard. Then I come back to route between each of the fingers, taking a full pass. Again, it's enormously critical to not tip the router or lift it straight up and off of the jig. You'll destroy the finger template, so be careful. Once I've made it all the way across my boards, I come back and redo all my cuts just to check and see that I haven't missed anything between those fingers. Once the cuts are made, it's time to check the results.
Looks easy, huh? Not quite. It took 15, 20 minutes of playing around with this and doing several practice cuts before I got it to fit this nice. But once you get it to fit this nice, you're set up to cut all day long. So take the time, make some practice cuts like I've done here. They won't fit perfect the first time. Your bit depth is critical. It's got to be just right for this jig to work properly. So take some time, make some practice cuts, and then you'll get it to fit like this. One more thing to pay attention to is to cut your stock a little bit over wide, a little extra wide, to allow for the inevitable tear out you get with the router bit. Unsupported fibers tear out. If you leave this a little bit extra wide, you can trim it off on the table saw and you'll have a nice looking joint. Frame and panel construction differs from carcass construction by using thinner members to surround panels, either plywood or solid wood. If they're solid wood, they're free to expand and contract in a groove. Now, perhaps the simplest way of putting a frame together is with a joint called a half lap. It's cut simply by removing half the thickness from each individual frame member. It's sort of like a rabbet cut, and you can cut it in several different ways. Topside with a router and fence, or on the router table.
I mount a router with a straight bit in it and set the bit height at about 1/8 inch. My fence distance is set by putting one of the frame members up to the bit with the bit rotated so that one cutting flute is at a point farthest away from the fence. I keep the setting just under the width of the board and lock the fence in place. Then I start to nibble the material away, moving right to left against the bit. I take small passes and double up 2 boards at a time for better support. The backer board also helps prevent tear out. Now I'll have to reset my bit height until I get to the final depth of cut. But you can see that with a small bit like I have in place here, this cut could take a really long time to make. So I'm going to head over to the bandsaw and get rid of most of the waste first. I start by finding center on my boards. Then I pencil in a line where I want the half lap cut to be. I cut in the waste portion of the joint and stay well outside of the pencil mark. Make real sure you don't pop through that waste piece and into your good wood. Keep your hands safely back away from the blade and always cut to the waste side of your joint. Once I make the long grain cut, I then carefully cross-cut the waste piece off. Now I can return to the router table and set my bit height for the final depth of cut. The fence is still in the proper spot, so I don't have to change that. But look how quick this cut becomes now if your bit height is set right. Keep your hands out of the way. Don't have them over the bit or dragging behind the joint. And take your time. Don't overload the motor. As I get closer to the shoulder, I'll be taking a bigger bite. You can hear it in the motor. That final pass is done with the 2 boards running right against the fence. And if there's a little tear out on the rear board, just make that edge an inside edge that won't be seen. If it's a big problem, use a piece of scrap as a backer. I'll come back now, and moving back and forth into the fence, I'll get any little spots I may have missed. The fence acts conveniently as a stop. Not bad looking. The final check shows that there are a few little ridges left on the cheeks of the joints. So I put down my bench hook and clean up the joints with the chisel. A rabbet plane would work nicely here too. Checking my fit, all my long grain surfaces are a little proud or high. This is just what I want. They're a little easier to clamp up this way. With the long grain extending over the end grain, you can put clamps anywhere you need them. Dry clamping is one of the most overlooked jobs in the shop, but it is enormously important. By setting up all your clamps beforehand, you can cut down on all that running around time when your glue is setting up. I set my long bar clamps first to raise the frame up and to pull the shoulders in, first in one direction and then the other. Now one set of bar clamps goes below the frame, the other goes above. I pull the lower set in now so I have room for my C-clamps which pull the joint cheeks close together. I use the offcuts from the bandsaw to protect the surfaces of the frame and to spread the clamping pressure out evenly. I get all these clamps ready to go, look to see that all my joints are pulling home, and check to see that the frame is clamping up square. By measuring the diagonals, I can tell if I need another clamp to pull this frame square. Looks pretty good.
Mortise-and-tenon joinery is perhaps the strongest way of putting a frame together. Mortises are simply holes cut in your boards, sometimes at the ends or anywhere along their length. They can have squared ends or be left round. And your tenons are cut to match. And like the half lap, they are composed of long grain cheeks and end grain shoulders. And as I said, they're cut to match the mortise, so they're either rounded or cut square. These mortise and tenon joints can either be through joints, like this slot mortise and tenon or this through mortise down here, and sometimes they're stopped so that there's nothing showing on the other side of the stick. There's also situations with wider rails where you have something called a haunch cut on the top to prevent twist. And there are lots of ways to cut these mortise and tenon joints with the router.
Let me show you 3 of them. The first method is topside with a router and fence. Laying out the mortises is the first step. I mark the mortise centers on my piece and then lay out the width of the mortise, in this case 3/8 of an inch. What's the right size mortise for a particular stock thickness? Well, I usually size my mortises a bit wider than 1/3 of the thickness of the stock, but I also keep it convenient. This stuff is 7/8, so I'll use a 3/8 inch bit to cut the mortise. Make sure you choose a bit long enough to cut the depth of mortise required. I use 1/2 inch shank bits whenever I can because they're stronger and they flex less than 1/4 inch bits. With the fence mounted, I can start routing, or can I? See how poorly supported the router is on this narrow board? I'll clamp on another frame member that is the same width and use it to help support the router base for the cut. You can see how much better this works. The fence rides tightly along the outside edge of the board. I use my pencil marks to help me line up my bit and lock the fence in place. I measure and set my depth of cut. Double check it, and then I'm almost ready to go. What sets my length of travel? I just have pencil marks to work off of. Well, I'll show you a couple of ways to set it. First, I rotate my bit so one cutting edge is just nicking the pencil line. Then I mark the edge of the router base on my board. That pencil mark is all I use as a stop. I move to the other side of the mortise and mark again. But here on the side farthest from me, it's difficult to see my mark when I'm routing. So I will clamp on a stop right at the pencil line to limit the travel of the router. I double check it to make sure it's right. When mortising topside like this, there are several things to be mindful of. Keep the router straight, no tipping or tilting. Try to take small amounts off with each pass to save your bit and your router, and take full passes all the way to the ends of the mortise each time. Also make sure you keep that fence good and tight to your work. You can really mess up a mortise by not paying attention and letting the fence and bit wander. This is our first method of cutting mortises. Here I'm marking the length of a mortise for a second method of cutting them on the router table. I put in the right size bit and set my bit height to the full depth of cut needed. I set my fence position by checking the distance from a cutting flute to the fence. I rotate the bit and check that distance. To set my mortise length, I rotate the bit so its cutting edges are in a line parallel with the fence. With pencil marks brought round to the top face of my board, I line these marks up with my bit edges to locate my cut, and then clamp stops onto the fence. At this stop, I'll use my little spacer to raise it up to allow chips to pass under it. Now my length of travel is set. To start the cut, I place my board firmly against the fence with one end of it against the stop. Then I slowly bring it down onto the bit. I move the stick right to left across to the other stop, pull it up off the bit, and then bring it down for another pass. I gradually work my way down to depth and never take too deep a pass. Keep those chips cleared away from your stop. This method of mortising is not without potential problems. If you move back and forth between the stops without lifting the work, the rotation of the bit will push you out and away from the fence. This happens on the router table when you cut from left to right on it, so don't do this. Always be careful to feed into the rotation of the bit so it pushes you into the fence. That final cleanup pass is done all the way from stop to stop. Carefully lift the board off the bit. That's our second one. Our third method for mortising uses a mortising jig and a plunge router with a fence. This jig is pretty easy to make. It's a U-shaped plywood box. The piece to be mortised goes inside with a spacer under it to raise it up. Another ply board is used to capture the work in the jig and to help support the router base. The fence of the plunge router is also held in place with another ply wall there on the outside of the jig. I move the bit down to my board with the mortise already marked out on it. A stop is clamped to one end to locate the cut and to clamp my work in place. I move the router to the other side of the mortise and clamp on another stop. Rotating my bit so its cutting edges are aligned properly, I then adjust my fence setting so the bit is perfectly centered and lock my fence in place. Check my depth setting and start my cut. Don't overload the router by plunging too deep. Take about 1/8 inch or so with each pass. Do you see how the mortise length is set by the stops that limit the travel of my fence? By placing a registration stop that will set each piece in the jig in the same place, my jig can index all my boards to be mortised with this setup. This jig is also adaptable for many differently sized mortises. Their placement in the jig can be changed and the length of each mortise can be adjusted. So that's the third way to route mortises.
The mortises we've used so far for frame and panel work can also be used for frame construction. Imagine this frame used as the side of an end table or low coffee table or bench. All the mortises we've cut, though, have been at right angles, 90 degrees. And there are situations where you'll really need to cut angled mortises, like in this stool. The router is the perfect tool for the job for cutting angled mortises.
This is the angled mortising jig I use to build my stool. It is a dedicated jig. That is, it's set up to do only one job. The floor of the jig is tilted at an 8-degree angle. A stop is screwed to one inside wall to locate my work. My stool leg is clamped in place to the jig. Here you can see the router fence limited by the stops screwed onto the jig. I use a spiral cutting bit with this jig. See how the cutting flutes spiral around the bit? These bits are used for mortising. The fence distance and depth of cut are set. The router is plunged down into the work and moved back and forth slowly against the stops. I have to be careful to hold the fence tightly against the jig. I use a spacer block set up against the stop to position the leg in the jig for the next mortise. Now I want this cut to be a through mortise. Here it is in the finished stool. So I have to either protect the floor of the jig from being torn up by the bit when it breaks through the bottom of the workpiece, or I can stop the cut short and then open up the mortise on the bandsaw.
Before you cut your tenons, you need to make one decision about them. Do you leave them round to match your round end mortises, or do you chop the mortises square and cut your tenons square?
To chop a mortise square, I first lay out the corners of it by taking a wide chisel and holding it back flat against the mortise wall, pivoting it over to mark the size of the mortise. Then with a smaller chisel held perpendicular to the board, I chop across the grain at the end line of the mortise to establish the corners. Now I just chop and pare away the waste straight down to the bottom of the mortise. With both ends of the mortise chopped square, I can now easily make my tenons match. To round a tenon to match a mortise, I first need a tenon. I start by marking center on my tenon stock, and then laying out the tenon to both sides of that center. I check my depth again and mark just under that distance by a 32nd or so on my board, and square that line across. I'll remove most of the waste on the bandsaw, just like I did for the half laps, but now I'll use a fence and a stop on the fence to locate my cuts. For the cross cut I use no fence, but I do mark the throat plate where I line up the end of my boards for their cuts. This is just a handy guideline. Now these little pieces of scrap are not to be thrown away. In the unlikely event one of your tenons gets cut too loose, you can glue this scrap back onto it and recut the joint. Of course, I've never personally needed these, but I've heard. I measure the length of my mortise now and mark that on the tenon. On this tenon, it's centered in the board. On the tenon at the end of this board, I can measure the top offset, which is a 1/2 inch, or just set the tenon piece onto its mate with their edges aligned and mark straight off the mortise. Now I leave a little 1/16 inch shoulder at the bottom of my tenon to hide the mortise down there too. I trim the tenons to width on the bandsaw with a fence setup. First I cut one side of each tenon, being careful not to cut into my shoulders. Then I trim that little 1/16 inch shoulder too. When it just fits inside the mortise, I'm happy. A slightly narrower tenon is okay too, because the tenon cheeks are the important gluing surfaces. The center tenon is cut in the same way. This is the tenon I'm going to round over. I want that to fit nicely between the rounded ends of my mortise. The fence is set to cut the full shoulder depth, but since my bit is relatively small, I'll have to take a couple of passes to cut the whole tenon. Notice how I back one board up with another for better support against the fence. This is a small enough pass that I'm not worried about tear out at the back of the cut.
I want the members of this frame to end up with flush faces here. How do I know this tenon is cut in the right spot? Well, I could set it up to the mortise and set a straight edge here and try and check it this way. But in a simpler way is really to just flip it around and hold the cheek tightly to this face and check this distance here. This is the amount I'll need to still take off the tenon for me to end up with flush faces.
I reset my bit height and recut that first tenon cheek so it lines up perfectly with my mortise wall. When the tenon is in place, the faces of this frame will be flush. But the other side of this tenon still needs cutting. The difference between a tight fit and a loose one is not very much. So do I feel lucky today? If so, I'll keep the same setting and cut the other tenon cheek. But I have another way of approaching the perfect fit, and that's to use a shim again. Here I've folded over a piece of drawing paper, and placing my tenon boards on top of it, I cut slightly thicker tenons with this shim setup. If the tenon doesn't fit, I unfold the paper, decreasing my shim thickness, and take another pass. If the tenon is still too tight, I'll remove the shim altogether for one last pass at this setting. But this tenon fits the mortise perfectly. Once I'm happy with how the cheeks fit the mortises, I'll clean up all the tenon shoulders. I take a wide chisel and holding it flat against the shoulder, I'll walk it around the edge of my board. I do this from both sides to establish a line across the edge. Then I take light chopping passes to establish this shoulder. Remove the waste and chop again. To round over my tenons, I start by marking a center line on their edges. Then placing the board in a vise, I file the tenon round with a bastard file. I want to avoid filing into the tenon shoulder, so I leave a little step, an 1/8 inch away from the shoulder, to protect it from the edge of my file. I remove this step with my chisel. This finishes off the rounding of my tenon. Make sure the tenon shoulder ends up good and flat all the way across it so that the joint won't show any gaps at the shoulders. When tenons fit their mortises well, it's a great day. Try to avoid tenons that have to be hammered home, and don't try to make your glue fill up a too loose fit. Stuffing an extra sock in a shoe usually doesn't help. I look for a fit that's not too tight and not too loose. It's a snug fit that requires a little bit of persuasion to bring it on home.
Sometimes you'll find it awkward to cut tenons on your work. Maybe you have a long bed rail you need to cut tenons on, or an angled frame. Well, the router makes it easy to solve these kinds of problems.
By cutting mortises into both parts of my frame now, and bridging them with what's called a loose tenon, you can solve this problem. Or say in your angled frame, you cut right across the joint and fill that up with a tenon.
Say you want to cut several of these mortises. Well, a template made to cut them can be a real plus. It can be used over and over again and act as a platform for your router base. A slot cut to fit your particular template guide can be used, and you can use different bits in here to get different sized mortises.
When using a template guide, you always have to take into account the offset to the cutting edge of the bit. I mark my board appropriately to locate my template and clamp it onto the work. The template guide is mounted to the base of the router. Obviously, because of this, no fence is needed. The depth of cut is set by zeroing the bit onto the work surface, dropping my depth gauge to 0 and then measuring and moving the depth gauge up to get my proper depth of cut. The router base rests right on the template, but because it covers it so completely, chips tend to build up in the ends of the template. A pencil and some good lungs work for a while to clear these chips out. But having an air hose nearby is a little more effective for clearing the waste away, so the template guide can move freely to both ends of the template. Keep clearing the chips away until you're at the right depth of cut. Do a cleanup pass to make sure the full mortise is cut. This is one side of the joint, and the template has been set up so the mortise is centered and cut in this 1.5" wide stock. But here on this narrower rail, the template is obviously not centered, so I add a spacer block between the rail and the template to locate the mortise properly. You can see how it's centered now. Even on this narrow end of a board clamped into my vise, the template provides really good support for the router base, so cutting joints in long, narrow boards becomes pretty simple. Now I have 2 mortises cut, so it's time to make the loose tenon. I mill up a long piece of tenon stock that is the proper thickness and just about the right width. I trim the tenon stock to width on the table saw so it just fits inside the mortise. Since the mortise ends are round, I mount a 1/4" roundover bit to shape my tenon stock on the router table. I use a 1/4" collet for this 1/4" shank bit. The round profile cut on both faces of my board will then yield a shape very close to the round ends of the mortise. I set my bit height off a straight edge, so the profile cut will be just a roundover with no shoulder to it. Since this is a bearing-mounted bit, I don't need a fence. The bearing will locate my cut. I do have to be careful to start my cut in from the end of the board just a little to prevent the bit from grabbing the end grain and shooting my board past it. Keep your hands well away from the bit and move from right to left past it. To clean up the ends of the stock, use a chisel or block plate. Here's a good fit, tight without being too tight. I cut the loose tenons to length on the table saw. With lots of them to make, I'd use a stop to help locate this cut. If the tenons don't quite fit, a few passes with a hand plane should bring them down to size. A nice fit for a joint otherwise difficult to cut.
I've had time to show you only some of the router's capabilities. We've just scratched the surface, but I hope I've clued you into some tricks and some new ways of thinking about using your router. Remember, joinery always equals accuracy plus patience. The router cuts very quickly, much more quickly in fact than the time it takes to do your setups. So do your setups carefully, sneak up on a good fit, and don't try to force things. Woodworking is great work, so take your time, enjoy yourself, be careful.